Room 307. Room 307, Chapter 1, Check-in. 6:37 p.m. The Alder House Hotel did not appear until Ethan Carter was almost on top of it. For the better part of an hour, the road had narrowed and twisted through dense highland woodland, leaving him with the uneasy impression that he was traveling deeper into the forest rather than towards a functioning hotel. Rain swept across the windscreen in relentless waves, overwhelming the wipers whenever the wind changed direction, while the last of the evening light struggled through the canopy of pine branches arching above the road. The sat-nav insisted that his destination was less than half a mile away. Ethan had stopped believing it 10 minutes earlier. His phone had lost its signal shortly after he left the main road, and the small blue arrow on the navigation screen now appeared to be moving through an empty patch of gray. There were no surrounding streets, no landmarks, and no nearby businesses, only a thin route ending at a pin marked Alder House Hotel. "You had better exist," he muttered, leaning closer to the windscreen as another bend emerged through the rain. The stone pillars appeared so suddenly that he almost drove past them. Ethan braked, reversed a short distance, and turned through a set of open iron gates. A slate plaque had been fitted into the left pillar, its engraved white lettering partly concealed by ivy. The Alder House Hotel, established 1894. Beyond the gates, a long gravel driveway curved through carefully maintained grounds before disappearing behind a line of trees. Lamps stood at intervals along the route, their warm light reflecting across the wet stones. And as Ethan followed them towards the hotel, the building gradually revealed itself through the rain. It was larger than the photographs had suggested, constructed from pale gray stone, with steep roofs, tall chimneys, and narrow windows framed by dark timber. The hotel looked less like a commercial property than the private estate of a family who had somehow remained wealthy for several centuries. Two extended wings enclosed a central courtyard, while the front of the building faced a wide loch that stretched into the mist beyond the grounds. Warm light glowed behind curtains and dining room windows, softening the building's stern exterior and making it appear almost welcoming. Almost. Ethan parked beneath an old sycamore tree and remained in the car for a moment, listening to the rain strike the roof. He had been driving since shortly after 2 o'clock, and the stiffness in his shoulders had become a dull ache that traveled down his back whenever he turned his head. Tomorrow morning's meeting was scheduled for 9 in a village another 30 minutes north of the hotel, and although his employer had described the trip as an opportunity to assess a promising development site, Ethan knew it would involve standing in a muddy field while 3 men argued about drainage. He checked his phone. No signal. The screen offered no network name, no internet connection, and not even the faintest suggestion that another human being might be reachable. "Peaceful retreat away from modern life," he said, repeating the phrase from the hotel website. That should have been a warning. He slipped the phone into his coat pocket, lifted his overnight bag from the passenger seat, and made a hurried run towards the entrance. The automatic doors opened before he reached them. Warm air surrounded him immediately, carrying the scents of polished wood, coffee, and smoke from a large fireplace at the far end of the lobby. Ethan stopped just inside and wiped the rain from his face, grateful to be somewhere dry, while the doors closed silently behind him. Somebody was playing the piano. The music drifted from an adjoining lounge, soft enough to blend with the murmur of conversation and the crackle of burning logs. It was not a piece Ethan recognized, though the melody possessed an easy familiarity, as if he had heard it years ago and forgotten where. The pianist played skillfully but not perfectly, occasionally lingering on a note or correcting a missed key without breaking the rhythm. The lobby itself was busier than he had expected. A young couple stood beside a table covered with leaflets, debating which walking route would be least likely to end in an argument. Two children chased each other around a deep leather sofa, while their mother attempted to remove a wet coat from a third, smaller child who appeared determined to keep it on. Near the fireplace, an elderly man read a newspaper with such concentration that he seemed entirely unaware of the noise surrounding him. The room had an old-fashioned elegance that felt genuine rather than designed. Heavy oak beams crossed the ceiling, antique clocks lined one wall, and framed landscape paintings hung between tall windows overlooking the loch. Unlike the bland hotels Ethan usually stayed in for work, Alder House appeared to have accumulated its furniture rather than purchased it all at once. No two chairs quite matched. The brass lamps had aged unevenly, and the wooden reception desk bore scratches that had been polished but never fully removed. It felt lived in. "So this is where you've been hiding." Ethan turned. An elderly woman stood a few feet away, wrestling with a large tartan umbrella that had refused to close. She wore a dark green raincoat, sensible walking shoes, and a pair of glasses suspended from a thin chain around her neck. A paperback novel protruded from her handbag, its cover softened and creased from repeated reading. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Not you," she replied, giving the umbrella another determined pull. "I was speaking to this dreadful contraption. It behaves perfectly well until somebody's watching." The umbrella folded abruptly, spraying water across the tiled floor. The woman looked down at it with satisfaction. "Intimidation," she said. "Works every time." Ethan smiled despite himself. "I thought I'd walked into the middle of a conversation." "You have now." She held out her hand. "Margaret Doyle." "Ethan Carter." Her handshake was firmer than he expected. "Business or pleasure, Ethan Carter?" "Business, unfortunately." "I knew it." He looked down at himself. "Is it that obvious? You still have your laptop bag over your shoulder, and you've checked your phone twice since you came through the door." "I was hoping for mysterious and well-traveled." "You look like a man who has answered too many emails." "That is disappointingly accurate." Margaret smiled and adjusted the handbag on her shoulder. "I come here every spring. The food is excellent, the views are beautiful when the weather allows them to exist, and the mobile signal is absolutely useless." "I had noticed that." "You'll survive. People managed perfectly well before phones began making us feel abandoned whenever they lost reception." "Did people not just feel abandoned in peace?" "Oh, certainly. They were simply less informed about it." Before Ethan could reply, a voice called his name from the reception desk. "Mr. Carter?" The receptionist stood behind the counter with one hand resting beside an open register. He was perhaps 40, although there was something about his face that made his age difficult to judge. His dark hair was neatly combed, his charcoal uniform fitted perfectly, and his expression carried the practiced warmth of somebody who had welcomed thousands of guests without allowing familiarity to become boredom. Ethan crossed the lobby, aware that Margaret had drifted towards the lift behind him. "Good evening," the receptionist said. "Welcome to Alder House." "Thanks, I have a reservation for one night." "Yes, we have been expecting you." The receptionist looked down at the computer screen. "Ethan Carter, single occupancy, breakfast included." "That's me." "May I see the card used for the booking?" Ethan handed it over, along with his driving license. The receptionist examined both, returned them, and turned the register around for him to sign. The process took less than a minute. "Your room is on the second floor," the receptionist explained, "number 214. He reached beneath the counter and produced a brass key attached to a heavy oval fob. The number 214 had been engraved into its polished surface. Ethan lifted it and turned it over in his palm. "A real key. Our guests seem rather fond of them. I didn't realize hotels still trusted people with these. They are difficult to misplace. You've never seen me pack." The receptionist gave a faint smile. "Breakfast is served between 7 and 10 in the dining room. The restaurant accepts final orders at 9, and the bar remains open until midnight. Should you require assistance at any point, dial 0 from the telephone in your room." "Does the hotel have Wi-Fi?" "It does, although the connection can be unreliable during poor weather." "Of course it can. The password is printed inside the guest information folder." Ethan picked up the key and returned his wallet to his pocket. As he turned away, the receptionist spoke again. "One other thing, Mr. Carter." Ethan looked back. "If the telephone in your room rings during the night, I would advise you to answer it." The words were delivered in the same courteous tone as the breakfast times, yet something about their precision made Ethan pause. "Even when I haven't called reception?" "Especially then." Ethan waited for the smile that would reveal the comment as a joke, but the receptionist's expression remained unchanged. "Does that happen often?" "Not often." "What would someone be calling me about?" The receptionist lowered his eyes to the register and straightened its corner against the desk. "If the telephone rings, they will tell you." A man carrying 2 suitcases approached the counter before Ethan could ask anything further. The receptionist greeted him warmly, and the strange exchange ended with such abrupt normality that Ethan immediately felt foolish for considering it significant. Old hotels had quirks. Perhaps the building's telephone system occasionally routed calls to the wrong rooms. Perhaps the receptionist had developed an unusual way of warning guests not to ignore them. The explanation did not need to be sinister, simply because the man had delivered it strangely. Ethan moved toward the lift. Margaret was already inside, holding the doors open with one hand. "You see?" she said as he joined her. "You look mysterious already. Strange instructions at reception." "You heard that? I spent 37 years teaching English to teenagers. I learned to listen while appearing busy." The lift doors closed with a soft metallic scrape. Unlike the modern glass lifts Ethan had expected, this one was lined with dark wood and fitted with a brass control panel. The buttons were arranged vertically beneath a small dial that displayed the floors. Margaret pressed 3 before Ethan selected 2. "You're above me," he said. "So it would appear." "Been given any mysterious warnings?" "Only about the weather, which I ignored." The lift began to rise. It moved more slowly than Ethan expected, accompanied by a low mechanical hum from somewhere behind the walls. Margaret opened her novel and studied the page she had marked with a receipt. "What are you reading?" Ethan asked. "A murder mystery. Any good?" "Not especially. The author thinks withholding information is the same as creating suspense." "Can you not stop reading?" "Certainly not. I need to discover whether the ending is as disappointing as I expect." The lift chimed at the second floor. The doors opened onto a long corridor lit by brass wall lamps. A patterned carpet ran beneath cream wallpaper, decorated with faded illustrations of alder leaves, while framed black and white photographs showed the hotel and surrounding landscape at various points in its history. "Good night, Ethan Carter," Margaret said. "Try not to answer too many emails." "I'll do my best. And answer the telephone." He glanced back at her. Margaret's expression remained entirely serious for half a second before she smiled and allowed the doors to close. Ethan found room 214 halfway along the corridor. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door opened into a room far larger than the photographs online had suggested. A double bed stood beneath a carved wooden headboard, facing a fireplace that had been sealed and replaced by a low bookcase. Heavy curtains framed glass doors leading onto a small balcony, while an antique writing desk occupied the space beside the window. A cream-colored telephone sat on the bedside cabinet. Ethan stared at it for a moment before shaking his head at himself. The receptionist's odd warning had clearly worked. The phone now appeared more noticeable than any other object in the room, though there was nothing unusual about it beyond its age. It had a circular dial, a coiled cable, and a small printed card beneath the receiver listing reception, room service, and emergency numbers. He placed his bag on the luggage rack, removed his wet coat, and crossed to the balcony doors. The lock lay almost directly below the hotel grounds, its dark surface disturbed by the rain. Beyond it, the surrounding mountains had vanished entirely into low cloud, leaving the world reduced to water, forest, and the dim reflections of the hotel windows. There were no other buildings in sight, no road, no lights moving between the trees. From the room, it was impossible to tell that anywhere existed beyond Alder House. Ethan checked his phone again. Still no signal. The Wi-Fi network appeared after several seconds, but when he connected, the login page refused to load. He tried twice before giving up and leaving the phone on charge beside the bed. On the writing desk, a leather folder contained information about the hotel's facilities, history, and surrounding area. Ethan opened it while removing his shoes. The Alder family had built the original house in 1868. It had later been expanded and converted into a hotel by the eldest daughter, Eleanor Alder, following the death of her parents. Several faded photographs showed the building before its extensions had been added, its original structure narrower and darker than the hotel standing there today. One image showed Eleanor Alder on the front steps. She was a severe-looking woman dressed in black, with one hand resting against the stone doorway and the other holding the shoulder of a young boy. The caption beneath the photograph identified her, but made no mention of the child. Ethan closed the folder. He had no real interest in the history of hotels, and at that moment the restaurant held considerably more appeal. By the time he returned downstairs, the rain had softened to a steady whisper against the windows. The dining room was almost full, filled with low conversation, the clink of cutlery and the continuing piano music from the lounge. A young waitress led him to a small table near the window. As he sat down, Ethan recognized several people from the lobby. The young couple studying walking routes were now sharing a bottle of wine, though the woman appeared more interested in a newly fitted engagement ring than the menu. An exhausted-looking woman in navy trousers and a loose gray jumper sat alone, reading a medical journal while eating soup. Near the fireplace, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head was entertaining two hiking companions with a story that required frequent hand gestures and several terrible impressions. Margaret sat by herself with a glass of red wine and her paperback open beside the plate. She noticed Ethan looking and raised her glass in greeting. He returned the gesture. The room felt comfortable, warm, and entirely normal. Whatever unease had followed him from reception faded as the waitress brought his drink and explained the evening specials. By the time his meal arrived, he had almost forgotten the peculiar instruction concerning the telephone. Almost. At 8:46 p.m., the pianist finished the unfamiliar piece and began playing something softer. At 8:47 p.m., a telephone rang behind the reception desk. It rang once, then twice, then a third time. Nobody answered it. Ethan waited for the receptionist to return, but the desk remained unattended. The ringing continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly. A few diners glanced towards the lobby, though nobody appeared particularly concerned. Conversation gradually resumed, and the small disturbance disappeared beneath the noise of the room. Ethan returned his attention to his meal. Only Margaret continued staring at the empty reception desk. Her wineglass remained halfway to her lips, and the warmth had vanished from her expression. When she finally noticed Ethan watching her, she lowered the glass and forced a smile. He considered walking over to ask whether anything was wrong. Before he could decide, the receptionist stepped out from the corridor behind the desk. He moved calmly with no sign that he had been hurrying, and placed one hand on the silent telephone. For several seconds, he stood with his back to the dining room, staring down at it. Then he lifted the receiver, held it to his ear, and listened. Ethan could not hear anyone speaking at the other end. The receptionist remained motionless. After a moment, he slowly turned his head and looked towards the staircase. Not towards the dining room. Not towards any of the guests. Upwards. The receiver stayed pressed against his ear as he watched the upper floors, his expression fixed and unreadable. Then he returned the telephone to its cradle. The pianist never stopped playing. Around Ethan, glasses clinked, cutlery scraped against plates, and guests continued their conversations without noticing that anything unusual had happened. Only Margaret appeared to have seen it. She looked at Ethan across the room. Neither of them smiled this time.